This week on Quadriga, 2012, year of elections, year of change. In no less than 3 of the world's most powerful nations, the U.S., Russia, and China, people will go to the polls in the coming year. France, too, could see power change hands. Whether the U.S. vote will bring continuity or change depends largely on the economy's ability to pull out of its long slump. What the Russian transition will mean looks less certain now than it did 3 months ago when Vladimir Putin announced his intention to return to the presidency. Meanwhile, in China, the jockeying for power goes on behind the scenes. Your host, Melinda Crane.
What changes will this super election year 2012 set in motion? And how will continuing economic turbulence affect political transition? That's what we want to talk about today on Quadriga, the international talk show on DWTV, with 3 experts who've been following politics worldwide.
Joining Melinda Crane in the studio, Hao Gui is from China and has been reporting for Deutsche Welle's Asia service since 2003. Andrew B. Dennison researches and writes for the Institute for Strategic Analysis in Bonn and also serves as director of the Transatlantic Network's think tank. Michael Stürmer is a renowned historian who's been the senior correspondent at the German daily Die Welt since 1989.
And I'd like to start out with a brief roundup of the countries where interesting elections are in store and then talk about some of the overarching trends and themes. And let's start out with China because it does go first. Its transition process begins in January. Hao Gui, this is normally thought to be a very orderly transition, perhaps the most orderly of the countries we're talking about today. But could there be some surprises in store?
No, actually it's boring because we know everything clear what is coming off because the Vice President Xi Jinping is going to be the next state president and right now he's working on his members in the standing committee of the party and we know that he will do his best to try to persuade the people there's kind of democratic election, but actually it's not.
Michael Stürmer, it is a critical time for China. What do you think the challenges are likely to be that the new leadership will face?
Ecology. The environment seems to be in a very bad state. Energy, raw materials. Raw materials, the Chinese have some, but not enough for a rising middle class which wants to live in Western comfort. So the Chinese are expanding all over the world, including, of course, Central Africa, even Canada, Latin America. They are not always welcome, but they bring a lot of people. Libya alone, we suddenly heard there were 30,000 Chinese workers to be evacuated. Suddenly, what were they doing there? So China has a problem in what's called peaceful rise. Rise, yes. How peaceful? And then, of course, on both sides of the Atlantic-Pacific equation, both Washington and Beijing have to work very hard to control their mutual concerns and interests. North Korea comes to mind.
Lots of challenges. Speaking of peaceful rise, Andrew Dennison, the leaders that come into place next year in 2012 will, of course, be the leaders who are in power when China surpasses the U.S. as the world's largest economy, supposedly going to happen in 2016. Who knows, maybe even sooner. What does that mean for China, for the U.S., and for the world?
Well, whenever China passes the United States as an economic power, whether it's in 2016 or in 2029 or sometime between then, I still think that the idea that China is rising will come increasingly into question in 2012. Up to now, the assumption has been China is the new rising power, like once Britain or Germany or the United States. However, I think in 2012, people will begin to see that China's power is based on a very tenuous house of cards. In an age of sustainability, the Chinese model is profoundly unsustainable. It is possible to get growth when you have a pro-head income that's maybe 1/10 that of the United States, an agricultural population living on $2 a day, you can get growth around 10 to 12%. But when you want to start growing at an income level that's similar to Europe or America, it's very difficult with a Maoist, Leninist, communist capitalism. And in addition to the problems that Mr. Sturmer mentioned, I think demography is the real Damocles sword for China. With the one-child policy, China is going to have a profound disproportion of old people dependent on very, very few children. And finally, in geopolitics, he with the most friends wins. China is surrounded by very suspicious countries. On top of that, the Mongolians, the Tibetans, and the Uyghurs in China are all also frustrated with the dominance of the Han Chinese. So China's weakness in 2012, I think, will be a dominating topic.
Hao Gui, the outgoing leadership was to some degree obsessed with stability. There have been 10 years of relative stagnation. Do you expect the new leaders to provide more dynamic politics and to be able to cope with the kind of challenges we're talking about?
Right now, China is facing lots of conflict, like Mr. Dennison mentioned. I believe that the new leadership, the new generation, so-called new leader generation, is doing his best to keep the stability in the country. But right now, they are doing their best. I said doing their best because they cannot. We see pretty much people are not satisfied with the government, and they go on the street and they want more money from the government. But right now, the Chinese government seems to have control over all the things. But the question is how long?
I'd like to move on now, leave China, move on to Russia, where elections will be held in March, and no points for guessing who are going to be the leading candidates there.
The usual suspects, Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, want to switch roles, with the prime minister returning to the presidency he held from 2000 to 2008, and the president stepping into the prime minister's shoes, as if Russia's highest offices were theirs to claim and share. Elections in March are supposed to cement an already done deal. But how firm is the tandem's power?
Michael Sturmer, any real chance that Mr. Putin won't become a three-term president? Is there any real opposition out there?
My bet would be 99 against 1. He will be. He will make sure, and he has full control. By the way, it's not his party. He is the chairman of United Russia, but he is not a member, which is a very strange thing. So he may decide that once he's in power, that another party will be better. He may also use Medvedev as a fall guy. Medvedev has been a dutiful shoe-in for him, and he had some good ideas. He even had an impressive staff, sometimes more impressive than Putin's staff, and they developed a more forward-looking the overall vision of Russia, but it was not to be. So Putin is running into a kind of dead end because it is a petro economy based on oil and gas and raw materials, and not the kind of society that you need to reach the end of the 21st century in good shape.
Mr. Medvedev has had a few serious things to say about the protests that we've seen in Russia. Mr. Putin has absolutely dismissed them. Andrew Dennison, do you think that he's underestimating the level of discontent within Russian society?
It is difficult to estimate the power of the protest in today's age. Time magazine talked about Person of the Year being the protester. Zbigniew Brzezinski says mass mobilization, not mass democracy, mass mobilization, people going on the streets empowered by their iPhone and by the insult to their dignity that they live in and day out. And that is certainly an issue in Russia, because if there's one of those great powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, the famous BRICS, the emerging powers, if there's one of those powers that's less sustainable in its model than China, it is Russia. And while the political apparatus is extremely strong, in the long run, I think Russia will have to make a decision between becoming more Chinese this incredibly dynamic population on its eastern borders or becoming more Europe. And at the end of the day, I think the Russians are going to move closer to Europe, reject falling together into autism and autonomy, and at the same time also not leave themselves open to China.
Mr. Sturmer, I heard a sharp intake of breath. You wanted to add something?
I wanted to mention demography. Demography is a real nightmare because the Russian overall population is declining very rapidly, 1 million a year. The only part of the population that is growing rapidly is the Muslim part. And that is very worrying for people who look south to the Caucasus or to Tatarstan, but especially to the North Caucasus. The Russians are simply caught in a situation which they cannot control. They have no answer to that. They also have an enormous brain drain. All those researchers going to either Israel or Germany or especially to Silicon Valley are a real net loss for the country. For a country which has to reinvent itself after post-BRIC, sort of, Russia has to define a new model. And then, speaking in terms of demography, you have 25% of the population who say in serious opinion polls they would like to emigrate. Now, this is a very bad sign for Putin and for any leader. He has to recreate trust in the future of the country. There's enormous a feeling of stagnation, although when you get into Moscow, the traffic jam is unbelievable. There's nothing in the world like that.
But interestingly enough, Hao Gui, the people out on the streets in the protests are, many of them, from the middle class, people who have profited from Moscow's rise. What does that tell us about where Russian politics might be heading?
I believe the 25% who is willing to go abroad, the most rich and powerful person which living in Russia pretty much good, but they need a kind of security which they can find abroad, not inside the country. And the middle class, they are not satisfied. It's normal, like we see in the European countries, when the people get poor and they want more rights from the government, they go onto the street. But the Russian, they need political rights, which means they need a participation of the political discussions, which they not get. They will not obtain that because the party of Putin, the United Russian, they get more support, over 50%. That's enough for Putin.
So would you expect the unrest to continue?
Yes.
Andrew Dennison, certainly Putin's been playing the anti-American card with a vengeance. He blames it all on Hillary Clinton. Do you think that he's going to get anywhere with that tactic?
Well, America is a great scapegoat, but at the end of the day, more Russians would rather emigrate to America than criticize America. So I don't think he's going to get very far with that. It's a pretty old trick. And, you know, Putin may be running out of tricks, because when you lose the middle class, when they begin to think their future is going to be worse than the present, then you do have a problem. On the other hand, we should not underestimate the difficulty of reform in a country like Russia. 20 years after the Soviet Union has fallen, it is still not just run by autocrats or dictators, if you will, but also there is a profound amount of corruption. And corruption is the real cancer to political order, to legal order, so that the guys in Silicon Valley will say, hey, maybe I'll send some money back to Russia. But until you get rid of that corruption, the brain drain will continue and people won't come back and try to put Russia back together again. And how you solve the problem of corruption, that will be one of our challenges in 2012, whether Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, or Russia.
Perhaps we should also not underestimate the difficulty of reform in the United States. President Barack Obama has faced absolute polarization and confrontation during 2011, and it looks like more of the same in 2012. That could mean an uphill battle for re-election.
Rarely has a president been re-elected in the face of the record joblessness and economic despair that have plagued Barack Obama's years in office. But the Republican challengers also face some obstacles. Frontrunner Newt Gingrich's 3 marriages could turn off religious conservatives, as could the Mormon background of Mitt Romney.
Andrew Dennison, what do you think? Can Obama pull it off?
Well, there are lots of things to consider, Melinda. First, we should remind our audience that the Republicans are at an advantage when it comes to the rules for winning an election. That's what explains why George W. Bush was able to win, even though he got less votes than Al Gore. People from Wyoming, a sparsely populated state where I come from, have 4 times as much power when you talk about the Electoral College, with their 3 Electoral College votes, as a citizen of California who tends to be Democratic because he's more urban. Nevertheless, even though the cards are stacked in favor of the Republicans, I think there are a long list of things that point to Obama being able to win in 2012.
His popularity ratings are on the rise.
Well, we've just seen some new polls come out, CNN, Washington Post, that do show that there's increasing frustration with the Republicans, that the issue of not taxing the rich is becoming more controversial, that this boycott Wall Street is getting more traction, and also if we look at the housing market, there are signs there that something might happen, and we shouldn't forget, America grows by about 3 million citizens a year, and at some point those people are going to want to buy houses. So Obama might finally be at the end of what was the longest recession in the post-war history. Final point, economics speaks against Obama winning. 9% unemployment, that's unheard of. You know, you don't win in those kind of times.
Dropping now, though, dropping to its lowest level in 2 years.
Yes, well, everything is getting better. We do complain from a very high level, we wealthy Americans. But what one should also see is that demography speaks for the Democratic constituencies. Just quickly, minorities in America, they were 26% of the vote in 2008, 28% of the vote, almost a third in 2012. They vote disproportionately Democratic.
Especially Hispanic voters, and they are also
becoming Hispanic voters.
Ever larger.
The millennials, important 18 to 34-year-olds, 4 million more millennials this time than in 2008, growing faster than the population as a whole, also vote disproportionately Democratic. And final important, as women become more powerful than men in America, more women graduate from college in America by about 2 to 1 than men, and single women in larger and larger numbers vote very disproportionately Democratic.
Michael Sturmer, the challengers certainly don't look all that convincing so far, and when I look at the state of U.S. politics in general, I have to think, are the Republicans on a self-destruction course?
Yeah, they look unconvincing, to put it mildly. The resurgence of Newt Gingrich is a very strange phenomenon. I haven't heard about the Tea Party so far. Sarah Palin seems to be out after her appearance in the last elections. I think Obama will win by default. I would place my bets 2/3 for Obama, 1/3 against.
We can still ask, even if he does win, what are the chances that the U.S. can be governed in a convincing, sustainable way?
That the U.S. can be governed? Well, governments are there to govern, and we are finding everybody who thinks he or she was elected to govern finds that it's increasingly difficult. Yes, there are obstacles on end. It's not only checks and balances, but also vested interests and some very strange things. I mean, you start a war, George W. Bush starts a war and lowers taxes. Now, that obviously didn't work, and he did it against all serious warnings. And now the great American electorate has to come to face this odd reality. America has been not only living but waging war above its means, and this has to be redressed very seriously because we are all very worried. The Americans are worried about the euro, we are worried about the dollar, the Chinese seem to be worried a little bit about their currency, and the Russians don't believe in the ruble. So currency-wise, we are getting into a very bad turmoil all over the place. But back to your question, I find it strange and in fact shocking that the great Republican tradition cannot come up with more than one serious candidate, Mitt Romney.
Staying with the question of governability and perhaps looking at the big picture, globally, Hao Gui. I'm hearing some people say that democracy has actually become a comparative disadvantage for industrialized countries, that it's impossible to come up with convincing economic policies in a democracy. Now, if we look at Europe, in the euro crisis, we've seen one government fall after another. We're seeing the French government embattled, elections on the way there as well. We've seen technocratic governments come into place in several European countries. For you, as a Chinese-born person looking at the picture in Europe, are you pessimistic about democracy?
No. I think it's not partly true that from the economic point of view, that democracy is in kind of way not good for economy. But if you take a look at the political rights, you have to see democracy is a very biggest thing and very fine and best thing was ever given. Because it's kind of gift. Everybody can see their mind, everybody tell about the politics. But from the economic point of view, it's true that you see the euro crisis or even the dollar. The Chinese not worry about dollar, about euro, because Chinese has own currency. They want to make that to a kind of a world currency right now. But on the other side, it's difficult. The world is becoming one economic, because the United States, the Russia and China were getting together. We are in a kind of globalizations, not politically, but economically. We are getting one, and we're going to find out. But I still think that democracy is a good thing.
Andrew Dennison, Americans have never been so dissatisfied and so frustrated with their elected representatives in Congress as at the moment. The popularity ratings of Congress are the lowest ever. Do you think that we have come to a point of economic turbulence in the U.S. where democracy is incapable of coming up with the policies the country needs to move forward?
No, I don't think that, Melinda.
But we've seen constant stagnation, polarization.
Well, it depends what your standard is. I mean, there may be some ideal of classic democracy, but that's not the issue. First of all, what is democracy? Democracy is a necessary but not sufficient condition for good government. Good government that provides for the life and the liberty and the pursuit of happiness of its citizens.
So where did you see good government recently in the U.S.?
Where do I see good government? The fact that the United States still has a political order that can absorb immigrants, give people new jobs, educate an incredibly talented workforce, keep an economy growing in a global catastrophe that we haven't seen in a long time. I mean, 10% unemployment, okay, that's a problem for Americans, but Germans had that for 10 years, and it's not like the end of the world came to Germany. America has problems. America is capable of dealing with its problems, not only because people go to the polls and we have a constant campaign, but also because we believe in limited government as good government, and the rule of law, and the separation of church and state. And that model that has checks and balances between Congress and the president, you may call it gridlock. You know, Bismarck said, drunks and children and fools in America are blessed by divine providence. Somehow it works.
And lovers.
You know, so I am very bullish on American democracy as a operating system for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness around this planet.
Michael Sturmer, some people are talking about the election in 2012 in the U.S. as being a dismissal election, that incumbents from all parties are likely to be thrown out. The fact is there's tremendous disillusion with incumbents all over the Western world. I put it to you as well, also looking at Europe, is democracy at a comparative disadvantage in times of economic upheaval?
Well, somebody has to take the more skeptical position. I heard with great pleasure from China, democracy is good for you. I heard from the U.S., democracy is, after all, good. Let me remind you of that famous Churchill saying, democracy is the worst form of government except all others that have been tried from time to time. I'm inclined to subscribe to the Churchillian view. Democracy is not immune to the experience and to the fact that all sovereigns destroy the basis of their own legitimacy. The way we are, even the rich Federal Republic of Germany, now the envy of all the Europeans, is piling debt upon debt. Even now that we are blessed by very positive economic circumstances, even now we are accumulating more debt in a population which is shrinking. We do not have 1 million plus young people every year. We have 1 million more old people every year. Nobody has the foggiest idea of how to pay for all this, for the health care, for the pensions. First, people don't want to produce children, and then they refuse to die. Now, this is unfair. This is unfair to the few.
Nor do they want to pay more taxes.
Nor do they, yes, nor Social Security. So democracy, we have to understand that democracy is a very valuable thing, but also a perishable good.
Hao Gui, last sentence.
Yeah, I believe democracy is a good thing because democracy is basically based on laws and regulations. And the problem, temporal problems, is not by democracy, but by rules and regulations, which we're working on.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to all of you out there.